Hello, everyone, and welcome. Such a warm welcome to all of you to our third installment for the discussion series of Harvard Alumni for Global Women's Empowerment. If this is your first Harvard Global We event, welcome. And for attendees who have joined us before, welcome back. We're so excited to have everyone here. Please feel free to share your location in the chat so we know where everybody is joining us from. My name is Leah Keene, and I'm honored to be the president of Harvard Global We, which is a shared interest group, or a SIG, of the Harvard Alumni Association. We are dedicated to the empowerment of women through education, dialogue, and connection among individuals who are working for women's rights and freedoms worldwide. We highlight and raise awareness about issues concerning women's empowerment all over the world, including but not limited to education, political rights, freedom from violence, women's health, and economic empowerment. Our board of directors is as global as our interests, with representatives in the US, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, and you'll hopefully meet at least some of them during our smaller group discussions later. Today, or tonight for some of you, we are so proud to hold the third event in our discussion circle series, which is our initiative to discuss current pressing news items in a timely and thoughtful manner. We work to empower women by addressing fundamental hindrances to their equality and their success. And in that same vein, we want to offer a space for a respectful community dialogue on pressing topics of the day. Our first discussion circle was held in January 2023 on the topic of women's protests in Iran. Our second was held in June of 2023 on the impact of the war in Ukraine on women, and we focused on the psychological effect of the forced migration there. Similar to the first and second topics of the discussion circle series, today's topic, sexual violence as a weapon of war and terrorism, was selected as a prominent women's empowerment issue with deep historical and geographical roots that was brought to the world's attention again by the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th last year. This is a topic that obviously impacts women and girls, and as well as men and boys, and several examples will be presented today by our panelists who are recognized experts in this field and have conducted research and analysis worldwide. This discussion circle series is one of several types of programs that Global We provides, including an annual Women's Empowerment Expo and an alumni student roundtable series, a movie club series, and a fireside chat series. We value your engagement with our organization, as well as your continued support to make events like this possible. Global We is a registered 501c3 organization, and any donations made will be tax deductible in the US. And donations can be made by clicking on the donate tab on our website at harvardglobalwe.org, where you can donate using a credit card, PayPal giving, or Zelle, or find information for how to donate by check. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's event, who's going to introduce our panelists to us. Please join me in welcoming Anna Butusova, Global Board We member.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you. And hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anna Butusova, and I'm Programs Co-Chair of Global We. I am honored to moderate today's discussion on the topic of sexual violence as the weapon of war and terrorism. As Leah mentioned, this is our third discussion circle. So our format for this event is going to be, we're going to have a panel discussion for 35 minutes. Next, we will have small group discussions for about 25 minutes, followed by closing remarks. We shared a few articles with registered attendees in advance of this discussion, and we'll include links to these articles in the chat in case you'd like to discuss them during the breakout sessions. Before we begin, I would like to share a few ground rules for the discussion, and we will also include this ground rules in the chat. So our themes and broad ideas can be shared after this meeting, but personal stories stay within the room. We have an expectation that the discussion group portion of this event following the panel discussion will not be recorded or shared in any way. So we ask you to also please share airtime and share responsibility for the group's success and well-being. And it's very important to treat participants with respect and consideration and highlight the value of diversity of perspectives as an essential part of the process. Everyone has come here to learn, grow, and share. And we hope you come up with ideas to share resources about our discussion topics today. If anybody has any questions or concerns about these ground rules, please let me know now. Now, I'm delighted to welcome our panelists for today's event. Please join me in welcoming Ruth Halpern-Kadare, professor at Bar-Ilan University, Charo Hog, a founder and executive director of All Survivors Project, Annie Fortsheimer, senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Heather Tasker, postdoctoral research fellow at Queen's University. So first, we would like each panelist to please introduce yourself and share more information about your work, including your research and expertise in the topic of conflict-related sexual violence. So Professor Halpern-Kadare, why don't you start?
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important event. I am a law professor at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. I'm actually a graduate of Yale Law School, not of Harvard, sorry. But I've been teaching at Bar-Ilan since graduating from Yale, and I founded the Center for the Advancement of Women, the Rachman Center. For 12 years, I also served on the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's the CEDAW committee. I was also twice vice chair of the committee and head of the inquiries group of the committee, conducted an inquiry against the UK. And since October 7, I have been immersed 24/7 in this horrific subject of the sexual violence and gender atrocities committed by Hamas against Israel. And of course, we'll discuss that later. Thank you.
Charo Hog.
Thanks very much, Anna. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with all of you here today. So thanks so much for the invitation. My name, as you know, is Charo Hog, and I would best describe myself as a human rights researcher and an advocate. I have worked for over sort of 2.5 decades in various conflict settings, including primarily in Asia, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal. And more recently, I set up about 7 years back, All Survivors Project, which is a specific a research project with a very niche focus. And the focus is on how sexual violence in conflict settings impacts men and boys, including those of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. All Survivors Project was set up as a research project embedded within UCLA School of Law, jointly hosted by the Human Rights Institute and the Williams Institute, noting its intersection with sexual orientation and gender identity. But we are now an independent NGO registered in the UK and in Liechtenstein, and looking forward very much to contributing to these very essential discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Heather, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for moderating, Anna. Thank you everyone for having me, all the attendees and the organizers. My name is Heather Tasker. As Anna said, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. I've been working on issues related to conflict-related sexual violence since 2016. I've focused my research largely on abduction for purposes of forced marriage in times of war. I've also looked extensively at peacekeeper perpetrated sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I'm increasingly looking at links between conflict-related sexual violence and forced displacement. I have a new project starting with fantastic partners in South Sudan to look at repeated cross-border displacement between Sudan and South Sudan, and gender-based violence as both a driver and an outcome of that displacement. The goal of my research overall is better inclusion of survivors' voices, perspectives, and priorities in transitional justice processes. I have some work right now with wonderful partners in Northeast Nigeria, where we're working to include survivors of abduction for forced marriage and sexual slavery by Boko Haram into the emerging and developing transitional justice processes in the Northeast, as well as work with colleagues in Liberia to look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations from many years ago that have still not been implemented, and how survivors of conflict-related sexual violence from that conflict, which officially ended in 2003, have not yet had their justice needs or support needs met. So that's a little bit of the work that I'm doing. I think I'll focus today mostly on the questions of forced marriage in times of war. I think that will dovetail nicely with what some of the other speakers are talking about, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Heather. Any fourth timer?
Yes, with great apologies that I'm temporarily unable to come off my non-video screen. I'm in awe of the other panelists. My background is less academic. I was a diplomat for 30 years, serving in Afghanistan, in El Salvador, and some other high conflict countries. And since leaving the government, I have spent my time trying to be an advocate for women in Afghanistan, and promoting at this point an effort by many others, legal scholars included, to have gender apartheid included in the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, and also trying to work for other ways that violence against women can be codified as another kind of crime that would have either a standalone treaty or would strengthen the CEDAW provisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. We also thank all attendees who submitted questions, and you will be able to recognize some of your questions as I will ask them to our panelists. So let's begin by asking all panelists to address the following question. In what ways do perpetrators use sexual violence as a weapon? And how might this differ in the context of terrorist acts versus a longer scale war?
Sorry, Anna, would you want to call on one of us to start?
Would one of you like to start? Ruth?
Okay, there is a difference between sexual violence used as a weapon of war and, how should I say, everyday sexual violence, if there is any ordinary sexual violence, but sexual violence at times of war differs in the sense that it targets not only the individual woman, but it also targets the whole nation of the enemy. It is as if the body of the woman is a symbol for the body of the nation. The women are seen as transmitters of the cultures, as bearers of the next generation of the nation of the enemy. And by attacking and by conquering and by violating the individual woman, the whole nation of the enemy is being conquered, is being violated, and is also a way to destroy the nation of the enemy, because very often, and this actually refers to long-term conflicts, the women are used purposefully to impregnate them, and so to force them to bear the children of the attacker, of the aggressor, of the conqueror. And by that, they also achieve dual goals, because these women who had been raped, who had been assaulted, who had been used for the purpose of as tools of war, who had been weaponized, they are very often being ostracized by their own community, by their own people. They are not being allowed to go back to their communities, and the children that they bear are seen as children that belong to the enemy, to the nation of the attacker, of the aggressor. And so this is a whole multifaceted goals and intentions which really distinguish the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war and differentiates it from everyday rape. Now, all this is taking place in a culture of patriarchy. And so the assault, the sexual assault, is done purposefully because of the shame and the humiliation that attaches to the victims of the assaults, but patriarchy makes it the humiliation and the shame not only of the women themselves, but also of the men of their society who could not protect, quote unquote, their women. And again, it's a multifaceted target that is being achieved by using this specific tool. And again, it makes it totally different from regular, if there is any regular sexual assault and sexual violence.
Thank you, Ruth, for getting us started. And I think this is a good general introduction. And if any of the panelists would like to add anything to it, please go ahead.
If I can jump in, I think there is also a normative and legal difference that is now creeping in terms of the way the Security Council and other structures are looking at sexual violence as a product or as a tool of terrorism. So I think in terms of the accountability mechanisms that come in, the kind of sanctions and the responses, the legal responses that come into play when an act or a series of acts are proved as terrorist activities. And of course, the question of command and control also sort of is integral to this discourse. So I think there is a legal definition. There is, as as Ruth pointed out, there is a very distinct difference in terms of the mechanisms of it, the intent behind it as well. There is also one point that I have to make is that I think we also do stand to lose an element of accountability, but also an element of how sexual and gender-based crimes cannot be just looked as acts of terrorism. I would argue against that, because once it gets into the terrorist debate, you have a sort of an attack on civil liberties that goes beyond, the legal accountability mechanisms that would come in, while addressing sexual and gender-based violence in conflict settings. But that's a totally different dialogue. I would just add on to Ruth's argument by saying, at All Survivors Project, we similarly argue that patriarchal power is at the seat or at the font of sexual violence in conflict settings, and it takes into its purview men, women, boys, girls, people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity, and therefore victimhood sits within as a product of the interplay between vulnerability and power.
Thank you. Ms. Forsheimer, one of the previous speakers mentioned the culture of patriarchy. So recognizing that gender-based violence in armed conflict is a critical global issue, do you think it's true that sexual violence in war and terrorism is committed most often by actors from societies that severely devalue women's rights, such as rights to freedom of movement or access to education?
Well, thank you for that. From my small sort of perspective in terms of what you see in Afghanistan is the fact that there can be a structural aspect that allows violence against women as something that's, goes beyond culture and gets into the legal system. And so that women have no recourse at all. And whether it's a time of outright war or basically heightened violence in a wartime situation. I mean, I would say Afghanistan is not at peace, for example. But women who have absolutely no recourse, who have lost all value to their families, those are people who cannot protest the violence that's being done against them. And aggressors against women can simply appeal to, in this case, the Taliban, to say that they're just fulfilling the role that they're supposed to be taking. And so there's impunity for the aggressors, there's no recourse for the victims. And I think there's kind of a blurry line, frankly, between what you'd consider wartime and what is just life as usual in places with extreme patriarchy.
Do you think improving women's empowerment in these societies would decrease the likelihood that sexual violence would be used as a weapon of war and terrorism by actors in these societies?
I mean, I do think anything would be an improvement. If there's no legal recourse, then you have impunity, and I don't understand any, there's nothing that can be done on an international scale if people don't fear on a local scale. Yeah, I mean, I think that something has to be done to address total impunity, the powerlessness of one gender faced with another, for any kind of approach to stemming what I think is behind closed doors in Afghanistan, an epidemic of sexual violence and just gender-based violence overall.
Thank you. And we shared some resources in advance of this discussion that highlight some of the aspects, including legal aspects. My next question is for Ms. Hog. We also shared a report from All Survivors Project, and the report highlights that the same patriarchal gender norms inform sexual violence against men and boys as they do against women and girls. So could you give examples of the ways in which patriarchal gender norms lead to sexual violence in war and terrorism?
Absolutely. I think at the center of this discussion is the fact that sexual violence is about domination, violence, and subjugation. The patriarchal or the perpetrator enacts and embodies patriarchal power and dominance over the victim. It showcases and enforces vulnerability and the powerlessness of the victim. Now, this is replayed in many scenarios, and in our work, we see male vulnerability in particular manifesting itself in situations of deprivation of liberty, in situations of armed incursions, in the context of recruitment and use of children, and in the context of forced displacement, in the context of mass migration. You may argue that at this point, sexual violence is also very pervasive against women and girls. And I would take you back to the argument that sexual violence is perpetrated against all people who are considered vulnerable. It is a tool to emasculate or feminize. So it is a tool with which, people will actually use the power they have to degrade a person to the ultimate point, which is that of a feminine person. So by sexually assaulting a cisgendered man, it is the ultimate form of humiliation and degradation. And it is really important to address sexual violence against all people, because there is enough literature that establishes and points to the patterns of violence that regurgitate in society. The fact that unaddressed sexual violence against any person manifests itself in the form of either self-harm or harm to others. So it is a critical human rights issue. It is a humanitarian imperative. And it is also, for me, as a woman from the global South, an ultimate feminist issue. To recognize male vulnerability is the highest form of feminism as well.
Speaking of some case studies in some countries, we had any start with a conversation about Afghanistan. And now if we move to some more some other case studies. Professor Halpern Kadari, maybe I should ask you a question. Why do you think many women's organizations delayed condemning the violence against women in Israel?
I think it's a very pertinent question, and as you probably know, and I think the materials that we shared, us in Israel, civil society, academics, the government as well, we're really outraged at the silence of the global human rights community and the global women's rights community, including UN entities. I myself, as early as October 8, 9, had emailed a range of UN bodies, including the CEDAW committee, which I was part of back then, and CRC, UN Women, of course, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and we already reported on information, scattered information at that time, and we demanded recognition and condemnation of Hamas atrocities, crimes against humanity in the form of committing sexual violence. And it took UN Women almost, I think, 8 weeks to actually utter the words sexual violence from their mouth. So, but it is a combination of several factors. First of all, we do have to recognize that unlike other situations of sexual violence in conflict, the case of Israel was done in such a satanic scheme that the vast majority of the victims had actually been murdered immediately after or even during the assault. And those that did survive, most of them were actually taken hostage to Gaza. And we should bear in mind that as we speak now, there still are 136 hostages in Gaza, including women who had undergone sexual violence, were victims of sexual violence and rapes on October 7 and onwards in Hamas captivity. And we know that from those who had returned from captivity. So there were, at that point, there were no firsthand survivors to say, I had been assaulted, I had been raped. And there were also no forensic evidence because the scene of the massacre was a battle zone for more than 3 days. And the 1,200 bodies of those who were murdered were piling one on top of the other at the morgue, where people worked as fast as they could to simply identify, to know who had been killed, who perhaps is hospitalized, and who had been taken hostage to Gaza. So there were no forensic examinations performed. However, several weeks afterwards, there started to be eyewitnesses who testified to what they had saw, to what they witnessed on October 7. And there were many pictures and footage of the bodies that speak and of the first responders who described the horrific scenes that leave no doubt as to what went on before these women were murdered. And I will not go into graphic descriptions at this point, but there was enough information, maybe not for the first 2 weeks, maybe not even the first 3 weeks, but after that, when the police did its briefing to the foreign media, that was a time that there could and there should and there must have been strong condemnation, strong recognition. And when I compare it to the reaction after the Russian invasion to Ukraine, I do not compare it to the invasion itself. I compare it to the reactions after Bucha. That's the appropriate point of comparison, because in both cases, there was an eruption of extreme violence that involved sexual violence. that also involved mutilation, severe forms of mutilation in the case of Hamas on October 7. And UN Women was very quick to react a couple of days after Bucha, expressing concern of the reports of sexual violence and demanding investigation and demanding condemnation. And that was not the case after October 7.
I think you're absolutely right about the point you raise about the diffidence of the international community to call things out. And I think we are in a sort of the most politicized environment, if you can imagine, when it comes to naming human rights violations. And we see the silence sort of emerging right from the highest quarters of the UN system, but also of the political system. So I agree with you. That's all I wanted to say.
And I want to recognize that we also want to offer this question about the timing of responses in the media for discussions in the breakout rooms, while recognizing that the articles we shared and the discussion today contain a lot of details of sexual violence, of rape, of abuse. So some of the discussions that our participants will have today, we want them to have in a sort of more protected environment of a breakout room. So I just wanted to mention that, and I thank our panelists for addressing these questions and in a way that we all can participate in. I heard today that while the nature of conflicts in each country differs vastly, the horrifying use of sexual violence to torment civilian populations, punish ethnic or political views, and is about maintaining and asserting control, and it's present in many cases of conflict-related violence. So I want to pose a question to Professor Tasker. Professor Tasker, you have been involved with conflict-related sexual violence projects in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, and Liberia, and also with new research starting in South Sudan. Could you explain how abduction for conjugal enslavement during wars has been determined to be a crime against humanity, and what evidence has been used to make this determination?
Thank you so much for the question. Just before I move into my answer, I just wanted to recognize and acknowledge the individuals in the chat who are speaking out and saying that they're survivors. I think in these conversations, it's crucial that we keep the individual survivors centered in it. Of course, we're talking about violence, and we're talking about political processes. And I just challenge all of us to make sure that we're holding that humanness, that humanity at the center of these discussions. I think that forced marriage, as we sometimes refer to as conjugal slavery, is an important kind of site of violence for understanding the operations of conflict-related sexual violence in war more broadly. What's important to understand about forced marriage is that the label or the category of forced marriage carries with it a whole collection of different modes of violence and of different harms that carry for long term into the post-conflict period. Of course, all survivors of sexual violence, both in and outside of conflict, carry trauma with them. There's stigma, et cetera. I think Professor Halperin-Kadari did a very succinct job of summarizing that in her opening statements. With forced marriage, there's an additional layer on that, where the community sees women and often girls as being inextricably associated with the armed groups because of this imposed conjugal status of marriage on them. And this is especially true when children are born as a result of these forced marriages. Sometimes children stay with their mothers in the armed group for long periods of time, and then after escape or release back into communities, they have that continued association. And so women and children are called terrorists, or they're called rebels. We see pejoratives such as little rebel or bad blood being applied to the children throughout their lives. And so it's that long-term imposed status of association with these armed groups for both mothers and their children that compounds the stigma that's already associated with having been victimized by sexual violence. And I give all of that background because it comes into how the crime against humanity of forced marriage developed in international criminal law. So we had the first prosecution for forced marriage in the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And it was the first time that forced marriage had ever been charged or prosecuted. And what was important about that is the prosecution, both the charging and then later the conviction on that charge, came very much from women's stories. So originally, the plan for the prosecutorial team was not to charge forced marriage. Again, it was a new charge. It didn't exist in international criminal law. And even now, it's not what we call an enumerated crime against humanity. For the lawyers, the international lawyers, forced marriage falls under the crime against humanity of other inhumane acts. So it's not named in the Rome Statute or in other international legal documents. But nonetheless, they charged it, and it was prosecuted in the Special Court for Sierra Leone because women were insisting upon the uniqueness and the specificity of harms that came with being labeled a wife. So beyond being raped, beyond the labor exploitation, the physical violence that they endured during captivity, being labeled a wife and being assigned or being abducted by and taken as a wife by a specific soldier, a specific commander in most cases, had itself a set of relational and social harms that couldn't be captured in other charges, such as rape or sexual slavery. It was this sense that by being labeled a forced wife, there was an erosion and a perversion of the category of marriage and the social norm of marriage in society, and one that again echoed and continues to echo throughout their lives. And so that was how it developed. And since then, we saw a fairly recent, I guess it's not so recent now, 2019, prosecution at the International Criminal Court for Dominic Ongwen. He was also convicted of forced marriage as well as forced pregnancy for the abduction and violence perpetrated against women in the Lord's Resistance Army. And so there's a developing jurisprudence around the crime of forced marriage, and this, again, the specificity of the harms that are associated with it. So beyond it being a charge of specific acts, it's a recognition that this imposed status of marriage carries with it a specific and unique harm that can't be captured through other charges. And most of the evidence from that, again, comes directly from survivors' stories, their oral histories, their testimonies that insist on justice for the unique harms that they had endured.
Please join me in thanking the panelists who have shared their expertise with us on such complex and deeply distressing topics. We want to now proceed with the small group discussions in the breakout rooms. So these rooms will open for approximately 25 minutes. So you would have 25 minutes to discuss the questions that we offer you, or you may discuss some other questions. So the rooms will close for everyone to return to the main room for closing remarks. So as a reminder, please follow the ground rules for our discussion circle that we shared earlier, and we will paste them now again in the chat. So I'll see you in 25 minutes, and I want to just read our discussion questions. And you are free to select one question or address both, and there will be a 2-minute warning before the breakout rooms close. So the first question is, what are the pros and cons of immediate responses versus delayed responses when it comes to official statements by women's rights organizations about sexual violence against women in war or terrorism? The second question, health systems across the world are often ill-equipped to provide necessary services to sexual violence survivors. What is the best way to manage the aftermath of sexual violence in war, given that many women cannot speak about the atrocities committed against them, especially in the societies where women are stigmatized after rape?